Hello, glazed ham dinner enjoyers. Welcome back. Season 2, Episode 6 of Severance was a great one. We're moving these plot points right on along. We have Mark, whose integration is fully taking root. There's a lot of discussion about relationship stuff in this episode between Mark and Helly, and then Innie, Dylan, and Gretchen, which I think we're on the verge of some sort of ethics issues there with Outie Dylan and him being in the dark. But we also have Milchick, who's seemingly having his own issues here. I really do think that his devotion to Lumen is waning, and I think his character is going to take a big turn between now and the end of Season 2. Then we have Irving, who's seemingly walking right into this trap that's being set by Burt and Drummond. But I really want to think, just seeing all the notes and everything that Irving has done, that he's kind of anticipated this, and he's going to kind of flip it on them, and he's expected this to happen. But we'll see how that unravels. I originally wanted this video to be quite a bit shorter, but I just get so excited talking about everything Severance that it just end up going through everything, breaking it down, and then giving myself like a little discussion time at the end. But I'm not opposed to making some shorter videos and some theory-related videos going forward, but let me know what you think of this type of video and this type of format. And yeah, without further ado, let's jump in. So we kick this episode off with Mark and Reghabi in Mark's house. Mark's obviously having a hard time coming to grips with exactly what happened at the end of last episode. Him seeing Gemma in the hallways of Lumen and her reciting off all of these lines like he was in a wellness session. And he obviously has no idea what any of that stuff is, so it came off as extremely strange to him. To me, this seems a lot less like teamwork and more that Reghabi has something to gain by having Mark on the inside. I think Mark being completely reintegrated gives Reghabi a leg up on whatever she's looking for on Lumen on the severed floor. She has some sort of interest in Lumen that we don't quite know about yet. So Mark is in full-on bargaining mode in this episode. He brings up the 5 stages of grief and how he's been navigating it. He's still holding on to hope that Gemma's still in there, and it's the same Gemma that he knew and loved before. Although Lumen has seemingly turned her into this wellness script reciting robot of sorts. When Mark brings up the fact that Gemma didn't recognize him, Reghabi says, "All I know is that she's essential. The Gemma you know is still in there, and when we get her out, it will be the two of you out here together." Next, we catch up with the MDR team, with Dylan explaining what he found behind that poster. He tells Mark and Helly that he left it behind the poster because he didn't want to get in trouble. He's still clearly motivated by the rewards right now, and he really wants to see Gretchen again. Which we see them both meet up for a second time, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Mark here has a huge reintegration sequence with his innie. His innie still has no idea what's going on, but he manages to handle it quite well despite that. It's curious to me that Mark doesn't seem to have any visceral reaction to these flashbacks, but I think he knows that something's up and he's just rolling with the punches to see where this goes. One of the shots in this scene that I really love too, and they keep repeating this theme, but it's just so fitting where there's a reflection in the mirror of the people that are in the scene. So in this example, it's all the 3 remaining MDR on the left with their reflection on the right. I just love how they constantly do this, showing the battle kind of between the innie and the outie. Milchick invites Ms Haung into his office. He's clearly unhappy about his performance review, and he obviously knows that those couple of things that were mentioned were from Ms Haung. The hostility between these two still remains high. Milchick says, "I feel I should remind you, you cannot graduate from this fellowship until I have deemed you Wintertide material. This will mean using your time well, focusing on your own duties, and eradicating from your essence childish folly." Milchick decides to give Ms Haung the floor, telling her she gets to sit at her regular desk. Effectively, this is going to give MDR a free rein to run around. Next, it cuts to Milchick, who's seemingly having a little bit of an existential crisis over these paperclips here. He seems to be training himself on how to use them properly, and his hands are shaking at the thought of his negative review. This is also reminiscent to me of Mark's hand shaking during the initial reintegration process, although I don't think that this has any deeper meaning. Milchick gets a quick glance at his review binder that he has on the table, and he opens it up and sees that, number 1, he uses too many big words. Milchick heads to this mirror on the wall that's hidden by a couple of binders, where he repeats something similar to what he had just previously said to Ms Haung. He says to himself in this stare down, "You must abandon childish things. You must grow up." Then his tone gets a little intense and he just starts repeating, "Grow up. Grow up." This almost strikes me in a way that maybe he's gotten this same speak from his parents or something when he was a child, and he's holding on to this deeper personal meaning to these words, as if he were constantly told to grow up by his mother or father. This scene was intense for me though. It honestly gave me goosebumps. Tremel Tillman just delivering these lines in the mirror, staring at himself menacingly. It's a pretty intense scene. This is the last time that we see Milchick in this episode, so it gives MDR a free reign of the floor, especially with Ms Haung at her desk. At one point, it cuts to the MDR floor showing that it's entirely empty, with all three of them involved in other things, and we'll get into that. Finally, we get a scene of Mark and Helly talking. I feel like there was so much animosity from the previous episode that they really couldn't get into anything that's been going on. Mark tells Helly about his encounter at the end of last episode with Milchick in the elevator. Helly's about to leave to go retrieve the directions behind the poster that Dylan left, but Mark stops her quickly and says, "Helly, we shared vessels. We, had sex." Helly doesn't bat an eye at this, though. She at first thought that he was talking about Gemma during a wellness session. Then she realizes that it was actually about Helena, and she's visibly shaken by this. During this shot, it racks focus on Helly in the foreground, and it really just shows her detachment from this scenario. She's not really listening to Mark, and she's just taking all this in. Helly's had a really rough go recently, so adding this on top of what she knows that Helena has already done is just too much for her to handle right now. Mark obviously reiterates to her that he's sorry and he thought that it was Helly, and then Helly says that it wasn't me, and she leaves. She ends up walking through the halls of Lumen alone, and she ends up in a corner getting a little bit emotional about everything that's been happening to her. They utilize another one of those fade cuts, which I really love that they do. They tend to do that during high emotion or impactful scenes. It's fading the two together between Mark and MDR on the left and Helly out in the hallway on her own on the right. We get to see that Dylan's loyalty to the company is paying off once again because he gets another session with Gretchen. Despite Dylan feeling horribly about how things kind of ended, especially with Irving, he still is completely motivated by learning more and hanging out with Gretchen, which explains why he left the directions behind. They make a little small talk talking about what their first date was like, and then Gretchen goes into some things saying how Dylan has tried a myriad of different things. Dylan comes back and says, maybe I'm trying to find something I excel in, like I do down here. She comes back and says that maybe he just isn't happy on the outside. The difference between these two, the innies and the outies of Dylan, is just so crazy. I love how completely different they are. Dylan is so motivated by work, and on the outside, Dylan's outie is just, he seems to be more of like a lazy slob. Dylan delivers this hilarious line where he says, "I just want to hear about my offspring and stare at your face." Just a completely unfiltered line. He realizes how awkward it is to say that, and he apologizes. But Gretchen thinks it's sweet. She's getting something from innie Dylan that she's really not getting from outie Dylan here, so she really appreciates that. Dylan asks her for another hug. They hug it out, and then they go in for the kiss. Now, I know everybody's talking about this and the ethics of, is it cheating if she hooks up with innie Dylan and all that. I'm not going to get too far ahead because I could spend a while talking about that, but it does hone in quite a lot on how relationships are kind of forming and being handled here, specifically in this episode. A little bit later in the episode, it kind of follows up with them on the outside. This scene is really tough to watch though, just knowing how they interact on the severed floor, because watching this, she gets to see innie Dylan entirely without all the faults that she's looking at outie Dylan with. And this is definitely starting to lead us in a strange direction with these two. Dylan then asks her how the second meeting went. And, you know, as you can recall from before, she kind of brushed it off real quick, but here, she says that it was canceled, and she didn't know why. Gretchen is fully aware that what she's experiencing with innie Dylan exists only solely within the severed floor, something Dylan's outie will literally never find out about. That makes it almost weirder to me though, because keeping it from him realistically, there's a 0% chance that he would ever find out. It raises like an unsettling ethical question. Does the secrecy make it more wrong, or does it, like, is this total separation of self somehow make it justifiable? I imagine where this is just some kind of sci-fi example, and this doesn't happen in real life, that people can come to their own conclusions, but I think it definitely creates this interesting dialogue about this. Also, you almost kind of feel a little bit bad for Gretchen here too, because it's clear that she kind of yearns for this Dylan on the outside, and she misses outie Dylan's lust for life that she sees in innie Dylan. Also, one quick thing I want to mention here too that I noticed. During this scene, when Gretchen stands up, the camera pans a little bit and it shows this plaque on the wall. It reads, "Dispatcher of the Month." So I think this kind of proves that she doesn't work as a guard at Lumen. I know that some people theorize that, and maybe she was the one that got the job for Dylan, and she was a night guard at Lumen, but I think that this kind of proves otherwise. Also, during this kissing scene with Gretchen and Dylan, it has this overlap cut between Helly imagining the kiss between her and Mark at the elevator, going back and forth between that and then Gretchen and Dylan kissing. This episode is really going in on the interpersonal relationships with the innies, and I think it's only going to get a little bit more complicated from here. So we've got Helly still sitting down in the hallway, reimagining her kiss with Mark while Mark's in the MDR office working. Mark's visibly upset just thinking about how Helly's taking this, knowing that he didn't do it in malice and he himself was obviously duped. Although, at the same time, they both come to their senses and run into each other while Mark is exiting the MDR room. Helly knows that they were both taken advantage of, and she's actually pissed that Helena got to experience that and she didn't. Here, Helly has a moment of realization that she can't let Helena take complete control of her. She says that Helena dresses her like a baby and essentially she runs the company. Helena is doing so much puppeteering, so much so that Helly doesn't want the little that she has taken away from her. Mark apologizes, but Helly reiterates that she wants to make her own memory. Mark here hilariously asks Helly if she wants him to recount what happened, which I think is just pure naivety of an innie. But from here, they decide that they want to create their own ORTBO 10 session, so they find an empty room on the floor that we'd previously seen. After Helly and Mark are done sharing vessels, as he likes to say, Mark smoothly covers up Helly's question about who was better, with a kiss. Mark notices some blood on Helly's face, thinking that she's bleeding, but they both realize that Mark has a bloody nose. Right away, we cut to his side room with both of them and Mrs. Haung in there playing doctor. She says that the air quality is so well maintained at Lumen that it has to be something else, and asks him if he's experiencing any other symptoms, or if Helly punched him, and she says not today. Suspiciously though, Miss Haung asks Mark if he's had any hallucinations. But Mark actually doesn't mention anything about this at all, although he had that crazy one earlier, so it's interesting that he doesn't crack here despite him not really understanding what's going on. This actually kickstarts an entire integration sequence with crossover memories, and it cuts to Mark in his house in his basement realizing that this whole thing had just been an overlap of him recalling what happened earlier. Mark is freaking out a little bit here too, because it was such a vivid memory of him at Lumen that he almost kind of loses his grasp on that, almost like a dream when you wake up. You don't think about it right away, it's just gone. Now, despite it being Mark previously who always wanted to speed up the integration, Reghabi here takes the initiative and says that they should speed the reintegration process up. Mark wants to know that that's safe because she'd always told him previously that they needed to space it out, and she says that there's a slight chance of hemorrhage, but they'll float the chip through the hole that she made in his head. Mark's having a Mark moment, so obviously he gets up and he's like, fuck this, and he rips all the probes off his head and he's out. Now we finally get to our boy Irv, who's in his car combing his stash, and despite him only having met Burt that one night at the payphone, it seems like he still wants to look good for him. Irv knocks on the door and Burt opens it, pretending that he doesn't know who he is. But jokingly, he lets him in, obviously. After Irv comes in, Fields yells out, "Attila!" Burt responds, "Yes, Attila." We'll find out shortly that this is their little pet name that they gave to one another. Irving meets Fields here for the first time. Well, as an Audi, Fields says, "Welcome back to our home." Irv obviously goes on and he apologizes for what happened during the crescendo of season 1 finale, him screaming, knocking on Burt's door. Irving says, "I'm sorry, I'm sure that felt quite invasive." Fields responds, "Nonsense, what's mine is yours, and you've brought wine." Don't mind that accent. There's this funny way that Burt is framed in this scene of them all sitting at the dinner table. Burt's framed squarely against the fireplace, he's wearing all black and the flames are surrounding him, giving him this kind of like hellish look, which is obviously done very intentionally. Irving is curious about Burt's start at Lumen and how he kind of came to be there. And the answer we get is pretty interesting, actually. He says that he was guided to Lumen's door by Jesus. Then Irving goes, "Jesus Christ?" Burt was going to church for years, and he said that he was a scoundrel in his younger days, so him and Fields thought he'd not be going to heaven because he is just a piece of shit. Although the sermon that day at church was about innies and outies and severance, and they believe that an innie is a complete individual in their own right, and that they are judged by God separately, effectively giving you a second chance if your outie were to have been going to hell otherwise. The innie would go to heaven while the outie burns, as Burt said. Although during this dinner, it cuts to Drummond getting out of his car with a lumen key unlocking Irving's apartment. And while he's in there, he's snooping around and looking at all of the things that Irving had printed out with all the notes of the Lumen employees. But we'll get back to that shortly. After Mark's little outburst with Reghabi, he runs away to a Chinese restaurant, eating basically what's a small family's worth of Chinese food. We get a view from the entrance of the restaurant and we see Helena enter. She sits down a few booths away from Mark and has a little bit of a stare down with him. She goes up to introduce herself, but he says he knows who she is. She says that she's heard a lot about his work and only good things, and he says, "Thank you, I've heard nothing at all," with a little bit of Severance humor. She apologizes about the OTC, and Mark asks her if she knows all about it, and she says, "I'm the head of the company, Mark," doing her little Egan flex there. Mark says that she's the one who invented this revolutionary medical procedure, which she says that was my father. Although in this conversation, they have this little weird, flirty vibe going on. The natural chemistry that Mark's innie and Helly have, I feel like it would translate technically since they are the same people. We get a little bit of that here. It makes me wonder if Helena actually really does like Mark, or if this is all just a ploy to get closer to him to keep tabs on him. She knows that he's been through a lot with the loss of his wife, then she stalls for a couple of seconds and says, "Hannah." This totally kills the vibe and it wipes Mark's face completely clean. Mark says defiantly, "Gemma." She knows that as well. This is her just kind of downplaying her interest in Mark, more than likely, and also probably to show her cards off that she's not some stalker psycho. Mark sees through Helena here and abruptly gets up and speeds home, wanting to do the procedure with Reghabi. But before Mark leaves, though, Helena and Mark have this little awkward stare down. I also think that this may have spooked Mark, potentially, running back to his place to complete the reintegration because he's afraid that Lumen might be onto him. Although it's tough to know at this point whether Helena is just really obsessed with wanting to feel something in her life, or if she also has some sort of agenda with wanting to follow Mark around just because she's so tied to the Lumen family that she needs to protect her future. Now here we revisit Burt and Field's pet name for each other, Attila, the namesake of this episode. Now this is interesting because they used to call each other Hun, now they call each other Attila. Attila the Hun was a ruthless leader of the group the Huns, which was from Central Asia. He led them through brutal raids across Europe that scared the Romans, and he was said to be a brilliant strategist and skilled diplomat, and the fear of him weakened Rome. After his death, the Huns' empire collapsed, but Attila remains one of the most feared conquerors. Now, with everything in this show being so meticulously crafted, this confirms my prior beliefs that there was more to Burt than meets the eye. But I'll get into that in a second. Now, their story continues about how their pet name Attila came to be, and Field says that it was 20 years ago when it all started. They were having drinks with Burt's Lumen partner at the time. Now, Burt shoots Field a little bit of a glare over the table. And you're thinking, immediately I was like, oh, I think he slipped up there. I think he said something he wasn't supposed to say. And then Irv actually says, "Didn't the severed office open up only 12 years ago?" That exchange between Burt and Fields kind of continues here, and they try to pass it off as if Fields is drinking too much wine. But it's pretty clear that Fields slipped up here. I think they wanted to remain a little bit tight-lipped in this conversation, but they let a little bit too much out here. At the end of the dinner with Irving, while he's on his way out, Burt kind of stops him to try to smooth things over with what Fields had brought up previously. But we know that Irv is a complicated individual, and he's out there, he's seeking answers, and he's not going to forget about this easily. Although the entire time during this dinner, Irv is playing it really cool. He's not pressing too much or asking too many hard-hitting questions. But I know with all the notes that Irving's written about Lumen and everything that he has in his apartment that he knows a lot more than he's leading on. Now, when I spoke previously in the last video about Burt, I said that there was something extremely suspicious about him, but I wasn't sure where it would lead us, but I knew that he was up to something. But I think at this point, it's very obvious to say that he's some sort of a Lumen spy or he's working with Lumen in some way. It was very clearly orchestrated that Burt would get Irving out of his apartment so Drummond could go in there and kind of kick around and see what's going on in there, because they're obviously very suspicious of Irving. Him having been the only one, especially as an innie, to kind of look more into Helena and kind of question who she is. It's no coincidence that all this is lining up perfectly. I think Burt's trying to pull the wool over Irving's eyes here by shadowing it as him being nice and inviting him out with him and his husband for a ham dinner, when realistically, I think they're kind of trying to figure out what he knows or trying to get in and friendly with him. And this isn't just so Drummond can sift through all of his stuff. I feel like this is a relationship that's going to be kind of prodded at for a little while Burt tries to get more information out of him potentially. Although this does lead me to another question here, but I wonder who Burt's previous Lumen partner was. Maybe it was Drummond. Maybe they were working together previously in the past. Maybe it was Cobell. Maybe somebody that we don't quite know yet that isn't an active character in the story, but I feel like there's something branching from that. Now, during the dinner conversation, though, after they talk about the pet name, though, Fields does ask if they think they ever made love at work. While he was seemingly just asking to make sure that they wouldn't pass around an STD, he says that innies deserve love too. And he doesn't seem to view this from an affair standpoint, which is an interesting contrast in opinion from what Ms Haung said last episode about them not being people at all. I think Fields is really humanizing them here, and he might have a different view than some people do have on Severance as a whole in terms of them being subhuman and not worthy of anything. Now, Mark rushes back downstairs in his house after getting back from wolfing down all that Chinese food that would feed an entire family. And he apologizes immediately to Reghabi, who is just sitting there eating frosting out of the container. Which I gotta say, it is 100% frosting. I was in the Discord a little bit talking about this, and some people thought that it was ice cream, but that's definitely frosting. She's going absolutely ham on some vanilla frosting in there, no doubt. But she just stares back at him blank-faced while he's saying that he really wants to finish the reintegration tonight. Now, she floods Mark's brain around the chip and says that this is going to take place and it's going to happen really fast. And she was not kidding. Mark immediately starts to see all the memories of innie Mark, specifically him getting with Helly from earlier. Now, this obviously freaks him out because he's seeing him being intimate with this woman that he literally just saw just minutes before at the Chinese restaurant, and he knows that she's the head honcho at Lumen, basically. So that being super jarring, his head just flies back, and he just says, "What the fuck?" Because he's obviously startled, but then he gets this sharp pain in his head. Then Reghabi scolds him and says, "Don't move like that." She wants him to go through this procedure and come out on the other end. So he has to be careful and take care of himself. And while all that's happening, right as that goes down, we hear knocking at his door, and Devon's at his door. Now, Devon comes in, but Mark isn't particularly present during this conversation with Devon. He tells Devon not to worry about what he's doing it himself. Devon pushes back, and then Mark begins to have an outburst, which is very outy Mark-like. Mark goes, "What's that smell?" all of a sudden. We see him raise his hand and move his hand, and he's struggling to do so, losing kind of control of his arm, which here he's experiencing the symptoms of that he's about to have a stroke. During this sequence, he has some flashbacks seeing Gemma at Lumen again. One quick flashback of him seeing Gemma as Miss Casey, and then quickly right after it flickers and it shows Gemma what she looked like on the outside with longer hair. Right after this, he falls to the floor, smashing his head on the ground. Obviously, Reghabi being on call right there, knowing what's going on, she rushes right up the stairs. Devon's like, "Who the fuck is this? Who are you?" So this is the first time that Devon and Reghabi meet. And now she'll know exactly what Mark was just talking about and what they've been up to and what the plans are going forward. And I was kind of curious how this would go, like how Mark would tell Devon that he was doing something so dangerous, but it came out in the most dangerous way imaginable, him having a stroke, and it almost seems like he had a stroke and then he had a seizure on the ground. So Mark is not in good shape right now. And we kind of end with that little scene of Burt looking out as Irving leaves. So now that we know that Mark's reintegration has completely happened and he's not done with Cold Harbor, at the end of last episode, he logged out of his computer at 85%, I believe it was. And because there was no work being done at MDR at all this episode, I don't imagine he got much past that, if any at all. And now that he's entirely reintegrated, this, I think, is the turning point for Mark's character going forward, because we know that he's going to refuse to do any more work on Cold Harbor, but I want to speak a little bit more about this in the end. Wow, what an episode. I actually really enjoyed that. So usually after I'm done watching an episode, I'll go into the Discord and just like the official Severance Discord, just kind of like go in there, see what people are saying, chat a little bit about what I think, and you know, there's a lot of people shit posting in there, but usually I'll check it out just to see what's going on. I feel like a lot of people really like this episode, but there are definitely a few that kind of said that the pacing was slow, or that they're spending too much time story building and there's not enough payoff, but I don't know that I felt that at all this episode. I actually really liked this episode. I feel like it progressed a lot of the storylines that were kind of investing ourselves in, and it's kind of building up to this crescendo that we will hopefully have a couple of these things tied up before the end of season 2. The thing that kind of struck me the most in this episode was kind of them delving into the relationship dynamic with the innies. So you have Innie Mark and Helly, and then you have innie Dylan and Gretchen. And they have a lot of purposefully cut shots where it'll flicker between both of them, especially when Helly was remembering the kiss outside of the elevator while Dylan was in the family room with Gretchen and they were kissing. They had an overlap there. They're kind of really going into this and exploring this relationship thing quite a bit. And they almost kind of tease at it a little bit with Irving and Burt, although that's obviously not how that plays out. And we can talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But I feel like we're kind of bridging the gap into like an ethics issue with Dylan and Gretchen here, because she's clearly falling for, or, you know, at least pushing that boundary with innie Dylan. And she's keeping outie Dylan completely silent here, essentially, or she's staying silent, and he has no idea really what the fuck's going on, because she lied to him this episode and said that the meeting got canceled, which obviously it did not. But I do still think that she's using that as a way to kind of protect herself, because she knows that she only gets to see that version of Dylan when she's on the severed floor, when he gets those little rewards, which might not last forever, because we still don't know how he's going to get kind of tied in with MDR and their goal, at least, you know, finding Miss Casey or Gemma with Mark, and if he's even going to get involved at all, or if he's going to say, you know, fuck you guys, I want to see my wife more, which he clearly does, because he says during that during this episode that he wishes he could be with her all the time. So there's definitely some interesting points going on here. I think it's going to get really weird, and eventually these things are going to have to be discussed with outie Dylan. But it's pretty clear that she's falling in love with innie Dylan, because she sees innie Dylan as the guy that she probably initially had married, and then he, you know, maybe he got depressed or he lost his motivation in life, and now he's just kind of going down a path that he doesn't really know where he's going. On that note, though, this is going to get exceedingly more complicated with Mark and Helly, especially because the reintegration has completely taken place now. So assuming that Mark is totally fine and everything went, you know, as expected, without any, you know, ill side effects or anything like that, it's going to get kind of weird, because Mark is going to be battling with these two sides of him now officially together, with memories of both sides. And obviously his main goal for the longest time has been to make sure that he can find Gemma safe and sound, and they can be together again like they were on the outside originally. But then you have innie Mark, who's obviously interested in Helly, and that's all that innie Mark knows. So that's his separate life aside from Mark on the outside. So I'm curious to see how they kind of write this, where he comes to terms with this happening. I feel like it definitely makes it really, really complicated for Mark, and I feel like that's going to be a huge point of contention, probably towards the end of season 2, I imagine. But yeah, we'll have to see about that. So I do have a few questions. I don't want to elaborate on them too much, because this video is already probably quite long, and I want to start making these a little bit shorter. I wrote, who is Burt and what is his significance to Lumen? Who was his previous partner? When they discuss that when Field says 20 years ago, they were, you know, getting drinks with his Lumen partner, and that's when they kind of came up with the Attila thing. I think Burt is definitely a Lumen spy. He might even have been one of the more integral parts to Lumen originally. When Severance was getting developed, maybe he was a part of that. I think that he was probably big in Lumen. It's clear that he's been involved with them for a very, very long time. So who his partner might be, it's tough to say for sure. Could be Drummond, it could be Cobell, somebody that we don't know yet, but I'm really curious to see how that plays out. But I knew it. I called it in the last video from the last episode that Burt was kind of being suspicious, and it seemed like there's a lot more to him than meets the eye, and I still don't think that they would have only hired Christopher Walken for like a mild, short little role. So Now, I also briefly mentioned this in my last video about Milchick's devotion to Lumen and is it waning, specifically based off of his little interaction with Natalie and him asking her about how she felt with the paintings and stuff. It was clear that he wasn't having that. But in this episode, it's kind of strange. We don't get a lot of Milchick in this episode, unfortunately. I do love Drummond, he's such a beast in this. It's tough to know for sure right now whether or not his loyalty to Lumen is kind of dwindling, or if he's actually flipped the switch and he's gonna turn it on big time and be, big for Lumen again, because he seemed to be affected a lot by what his review said. I love that mirror scene though. That mirror scene was it was crazy. It actually did give me goosebumps. Like Drummond and the way that he delivered those lines was just grow up. Grow up. Sorry. Anyway, yeah, that was great. I really love that. Okay, and then does Helena really like Mark, or is it motivated by Lumen agenda? So originally, and I still kind of think that it's not about her liking Mark in particular, but more about her liking the fact that somebody likes her back. Even though Mark, he likes Helly, he doesn't like her. I think that's obviously very clear at this point. But she got to have a little taste of what it was like to be Helly, and I feel like she's addicted to that feeling. And that's why she's kind of creeping around Mark right now. And she watched him leave last episode after he was leaving work. She shows up while he's eating in the Chinese restaurant. So I think that's a little bit more what it is. We could probably see her kind of slowly go to the other side, especially if reintegrated Mark ends up kind of seeing her and it doesn't go well. She could kind of just go right back and be the Lumen slave that she's always been, more or less. And then the last thing that I have is Mark has not completed Cold Harbor. So what's next for that? We saw Mark end last episode at 85% on Cold Harbor, and it's pretty clear that no work got done at all at MDR this episode. Like literally none. They even cut to a shot of the floor and nobody was even there because Dylan was with his wife, and then Mark was with Helly and they were roaming around and everything like that. So now that he's completely reintegrated, he's obviously not going to want to do any work on Cold Harbor. And we see in one of the previews that Drummond actually slams Mark against the wall. So that's got to be kind of related in some way. Maybe Mark is refusing to work at all and he's asking questions and wants to know what's going on. Just the last thing is we haven't seen Cobell in a while, but we're expecting her soon. So I'm very excited to see what happens with that, because I think that's who Irving was calling. I think Irv was calling Cobell. I want that to be the case because I feel like she's got this like vengeance arc that she's going to go on against Lumen. But I love the episode. Episode was great. I think it's kind of pushing us in the right direction for what's going to happen with wrapping up season 2. And we still have, I think, 4 episodes left? 3 or 4 episodes left. So there's a lot. Mark is completely reintegrated and we get him for the rest of the season. So very excited for that. If you guys made it this far, I want to thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it. Leave a like, comment. Let me know what you think about those questions there. And we'll see you in the next episode. See ya.